I would like to welcome Dustin Moskovitz to the stage, the CEO and co-founder of Asana.
Thanks, Jess.
Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So you started Asana 2009, 8?
Yeah, 2009.
Okay.
Yeah.
You guys have been growing quickly. Most recent valuation, $600 million.
That's correct.
But how's it going?
It's going well. I'll definitely say enterprise software is a lot harder than it seems from the outside. But yeah, we've made a lot of progress. So we started the company in 2009. We actually launched the product at the very end of 2011. So we've had a good 5 years of growth now. And yeah, it turns out that there's a much bigger MVP for what it takes to provide good work tracking to companies. But we feel really great about where the product is now, especially with the launch we did in September of custom fields, which was sort of the last big building block from the original vision.
So talk about, broadly the productivity landscape is,
Sure.
There are a lot of different players. Where do you guys see yourself fitting in?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we basically think about the overall collaboration software market, and there's three big categories. So two of those everyone's really familiar with. So there's files and document collaborations. That's everything from Dropbox, Box, the Google Apps Suite. And then there's messaging and communications. So that's of course Slack is the elephant, or the 50,000 pound gorilla in the room there. But also things like Skype, the enterprise social networks, including the new Facebook product. And Yammer, the older ones. And then our category is what we call work tracking. So work tracking is different from the others because it's basically allowing you to track who's doing what by when. So it answers these three really key questions for your team of what are the next steps between now and accomplishing our next goal, who's responsible for each of them, and when are they expected to be done.
Aren't they merging? You guys have conversations, which is not messaging, but it's sort of.
Sure.
And, so yeah, how do you think about that? And
yeah, it's possible in the very long run that they'll merge, but they're each such giant surface areas.
So you think people will use Asana and Slack and Dropbox
Absolutely.
and Google Docs? Okay.
Absolutely. That's exactly our world today. We use all of those products quite heavily. They're all basically always open tabs for me. And so there is some overlap at the edges with, as you said, so Asana has conversations, and that really, we built that sort of in service of letting you actually shut down your mailing list software, because that was kind of one of the last key things that was distracting people in their sort of notification stream. But I think it's perfectly okay if people end up adopting other pieces of software to do that, and we'll just end up integrating with them.
Got it. What do you think about Facebook Workplace? One of the things you said, right, is Asana came out of the tools and processes you built at Facebook from an internal.
Yes.
And that's kind of their marketing line for Workplace. So
sure.
How are they? What do you just think of the product?
Yeah, I haven't spent a whole lot of time in it, but I feel like I'm familiar with it. But I think it's a great idea. Even before they had this sort of work product, a lot of teams were using Facebook in this way, including, Asana has a Facebook group that we use just sort of for social chatter. If people want to, invite each other out to an event or a concert or something like that.
Don't you use Slack for that? Now I'm really confused. Maybe I'm doing all of this wrong.
Well, so I think that the key difference between a Facebook group or Yammer group and something like Slack is basically Slack is synchronous unthreaded, so it's a chat room, and Facebook is asynchronous threaded, and I think those are just a really powerful distinction. So if you do want to do something like, hey, I'm having an event on Saturday, who wants to come? You don't want that interleaved with the 20 other conversations you happen to want to have with that group. Now sometimes synchronous is exactly what you need when you actually want to say, hey, let's get together, we need to hash this out right now. That's when Slack works really well.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if we'll see pinned Slacks, sort of, is that
Yeah, I think it'll be really interesting to see how they develop their product, and I think that, I do put Slack and Facebook in the same category, so they're going to end up competing more, and, the Facebook enterprise product also has chat too, right? It's there. They don't have a super well-formed version of Rooms, but I wouldn't be surprised if they went there.
Mm-hmm. So you guys have also, one of those companies selling to consumers and selling to companies, right?
Yep.
13,000 businesses are using Asana.
Yep.
What is that like? And how have you guys approached the sales piece of it? We talked a little bit with Dennis Woodside earlier, and I often hear from tech companies, we have this core passionate base of consumers, so we don't really have to sell our business product, but I never kind of really believe that. So What do you guys do?
Sure. No, yeah, you know, I always am careful to sort of distance ourselves from like, you know, Atlassian or the language that Dropbox was using, especially like 3 or 4 years ago. We really do, you know, we really do think of our product as something that you sell. We have a sales team. We call them salespeople. But we are a freemium product. So a lot of people come to our service by first, you know, using it at home or using it, you know, for something that's not a business use case, and then they upgrade into the enterprise product. But we think of that more as marketing than sales. And to be honest, there's also there are a lot of great sort of consumer task lists out there. So we don't really think of that as like our mission. We're kind of, you know, we kind of think the existing products are pretty good, but for big teams who have much more complex workflows, that's where we think there's really a lot of value to add. So we really think of that as our core business, and it happens to be really useful for also like managing a household or like putting on a wedding or something like that, and so we may as well let people use it for that.
So what's a big team and like what size?
I mean, well, many of the personal task managers are single player, right? So 2 people is big enough.
Yeah.
But you know, you could get away with you know, sharing a spreadsheet or something with like 2 or 3 people. But as soon as you get to 5 or 10, I really think you need real work tracking software like Asana.
And how big? I mean, do you go after companies that have hundreds of people on it, or what's your?
Yeah, so our largest deployments are in the low thousands, but they're inside companies that have hundreds of thousands of people, you know, or at least 100,000 people. So I do think Asana works in any size organization. We don't yet have an example of sort of like wall-to-wall usage in one of those organizations, but I think it's just a matter of time.
And where do you think growth will come from? Will it come from growing inside big organizations? Will it come from the 5-person teams?
Both.
They're not paying, right? The 5-person teams aren't paying.
Yeah, well, most of the 5-person teams aren't paying, but some of them do because some of the functionality is premium. So we have a paywall that's defined both by the size of the team and by particular pieces of functionality. So a lot of people do decide that's worth it. So I think, you know, the growth will come from both, but I think most of the revenue will likely come from larger deployments.
So one thing I've always admired about Asana and how you've built it is not just the culture, but also how you think deeply about things like diversity and even employee, you know, equity and comp and what vesting schedules should be. And I think those are obviously important topics here. So, I mean, maybe taking the comp and piece first. I mean, what trends are you seeing and where are you pushing the envelope because you feel like the current system's kind of broken?
Yeah. So yeah, we've thought a lot about this, and I think the reality is just the ecosystem has changed quite a bit. So if you go back, you know, 15 years even, people got options, but they sort of like wrote them off as like probably not worth anything. They focused entirely on their salary, and then in the sort of pre-Facebook IPO years, they started to be thought of as more part of your real total comp. There started to be liquidity opportunities. That was when the second market first appeared on the scene, and employees just sort of started taking it into their own hands as like, okay, as soon as I get an option, I can execute it, I can sell it, it may as well be liquid comp. And then that, of course, caused all these 409A issues, and so companies started to become much more restrictive about it. And now we're in this phase where you do get options, you think of it as part of your total comp, but they tend to be extremely illiquid. You actually have transfer restrictions on them. And there's this really long period to IPO, sometimes more than 10 years, which is like totally unprecedented. And so I think it's important to think about these things differently. So the one place that I've really pushed on is the option exercise window. So most startup employees don't know this, but if you get options and you leave a company, the default is you have 90 days to execute them or you lose them. And given that people think of this as their total comp, I just like find that totally unconscionable that you might just like lose some of it because you don't have enough cash to be able to like pay the taxes or pay the strike price. So one of the things we've done is we have 10-year option exercise windows. So if you leave, you have 10 years from when the option was issued to execute it before you lose it.
What did your investors think about that? I've heard pushback from investors because they also worry that it will affect retention, that people won't stay around to.
Yeah, I think it's possible that it will affect retention, and I think the sort of standard thinking on this is those exercise windows are a retention mechanism, and I think from a sort of strictly I don't know the right way to characterize it, but I mean it's true. Like that is a method you can use. The way we look at it is like, one, it's just the right thing to do because this is how employees think about it, and this is sort of how they assume it works, and then it turns out they're being deceived unless you're very careful to explain it to them. And also we think it's helpful for closing people at the beginning. Because otherwise, there was actually a period of time a couple years ago where we saw a lot of candidates were going more towards the much larger companies, the Google and Facebooks of the world, because they just sort of started devaluing the startup equity entirely. So for us, it's a way to get people to say, like, to actually value that again and get us closer to the world we were in 2006, 2007. And as a consequence, we actually give out a little less equity because they actually are giving it more full value. So I think you can make the argument both ways, but a lot of investors in the Valley I think are sort of stuck in the way of thinking about it from 10 years ago and when IPO windows were shorter. And I think it's just time to reevaluate it in the current context.
Cool. What about diversity? I mean, what are you guys doing? Are you doing anything in your hiring process to bring more women, bring in more diverse candidates, into the company?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're doing things all across the company, but thinking about the hiring process in particular, one is just reaching out to those networks in a more proactive way, including next week I'm going on stage at the Tech Inclusion Conference, just partly in service of that, going to colleges that have minorities represented more, like historically black colleges. And then in the hiring process itself, we've just done a lot of research on what causes those people to inappropriately fall out of the pipeline. And that's everything from unconscious bias, so the interviewers are actually giving them no hires, to also how the candidate themselves approaches things. So one of the things we've done is created an interview guide of like, here's what you can expect, here's how you should prep, here's the types of questions you ask. And that just like helps people go in from more of a confident stance. But there's all this research where like, minorities do worse in these situations strictly because people expect them to do worse and not because they're actually worse. So the more you can kind of set them up to succeed, the more accurate a read you'll get.
Cool. I'd love to talk a little bit about philanthropy.
Sure.
You guys are, you and Carrie have good ventures, are insanely generous. And you decide to, maybe talk about your focus areas and then why you decided to get involved in politics this year.
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot of focus areas, so I'll try and run through them quickly, but there's sort of two sides to our philanthropy. One is what we think of as like the GiveWell side, so GiveWell's a charity evaluator, and what they do is they look for the best charities in the world that are proven cost-effective and have room for more funding. So this tends to be global poverty and global health and poverty alleviation, so especially organizations like Give Directly and Against Malaria Foundation. So that's where the bulk of the dollars go, is that category. We've also recently started the Open Philanthropy Project, which is more about highly leveraged areas that still have some risks. So it's not proven cost effective, but it's highly leveraged. And there we've established a couple core areas of global catastrophic risks. So that's everything from climate change to biosecurity to risk from advanced artificial intelligence, global policy, and there's a couple sub areas in there, including macroeconomic policy and criminal justice reform. And then science is probably scientific research is probably the least developed right now, but starting to make some grants there as well.
Cool. And what about, so you've given somewhere between 20 and 30 million, if I count to helping the Democrats win in
Sure.
a couple of weeks.
Yep.
So what was the thinking behind that? And that was, because it was kind of an aberration for you to decide to do that, and you've written a bit about it, but.
Yeah, exactly. So, I'll be careful just to say up front that that's not really the foundation work. We do think about it philanthropically, but it's Carrie and I personally doing that. And really just, I think everyone is aware the selection cycle is very special. There's a very special candidate running. And, frankly, that hit us as people in a very strong way. So it was just something that, as I wrote, I just felt compelled we had to do something. We couldn't just sit on the sidelines. Additionally, from the philanthropic standpoint, looking at the policies, it just became really clear that a Trump presidency would mean that a ton of the issues we cared about would just be set back. So all of the other work we were doing, all the other grant making was sort of for naught if this person came into power, get wiped out. So from a pure economic standpoint, the dollars seem just as leveraged as those actual grants, particularly in areas like immigration and criminal justice reform.
And have you learned, in going through with the donations and working with organizations, have you learned anything about the political system that's made you feel like it is something you want to influence and get involved in more or less? And I'm thinking of it in the context of like Silicon Valley and politics is always a a hot topic where some people like dip their toe in and then they shun the system and say, I don't want to do anything with it.
Yeah, I think it goes both ways. It's been both more and less scary than we thought in some ways, but before we got involved, I called Tom Steyer, who's the biggest Democratic donor. I was like, what should I expect? How does this go for you? Will people harass me on the street? And he kind of like, calmed me down. He's like, look, you live in California. Like, people are going to thank you. It's gonna be fine. And, that's been right.
Stay in California.
Yeah. I'm from Florida too. I'm from the South, so like, it's not like I don't have any Trump supporters in my network. There are those awkward conversations, but for the most part, that's felt good. There has been just a ton of inbound interest in like, okay, well, what about this, and what about other sort of donation requests, and I've had to sort of set some clear boundaries there. But for the most part, we will still be working on policy, because that's been something we've been doing at Open Phil for a long time. I don't know if we'll continue to support presidential candidates, because as I've written about, we're not like hardline party Democrats. We don't necessarily think the Republican candidate is like worth fighting in this strong way. We haven't been participating in a strong way in the Senate races, for example. So we'll just have to see each election as it comes, and whether our same logic makes sense.
Do you think it's important for the tech industry to pay more attention to politics?
I think you're better equipped to answer that than me. I think it depends a lot on your business, right? Coming from enterprise software, it feels a little less salient. More interested in European politics, frankly, from that perspective.
Because of data privacy.
Yeah, data privacy and stuff like that. But if you're Facebook, yeah, absolutely, you need to be involved, and I think they're just becoming increasingly involved.
Great. Questions for Dustin? I think we have time for one or two. If you can shout it out and I'll repeat it. Cool. Go.
Culture question.
Sure.
You're very likely a very engineering-oriented company, right? Yet you're an enterprise software business. So you, as an engineer, have had to hire your first kind of classic enterprise salespeople, which isn't always exactly identical to engineering culture.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about how that works at Asana?
Great. And just quickly, the question is, how do you, as an engineering culture-driven company, integrate salespeople into your culture?
Yeah. So I would characterize it a little differently. There's a spectrum of cultures like this, and we really describe Asana as product-led. So my co-founder, Justin, also has an engineering background, but for a long time he was a product manager. We've also gone to a lot of trouble to hire great leaders in design, great leaders in marketing. And so I would say if you actually came into the Asana culture, you would experience it as more balanced than that, rather than the sort of classic Google-style engineering culture. And in general, that's been our explicit strategy. Is a lot of the products that existed in the market when we started, like Jira or Track or something, were products built for engineers by engineers. And I think that allowed them to succeed really well in the software market, but we recognize that just wouldn't be good enough for the mass market. So it's been something that we've explicitly fought with our own biases, and also just tried to hire in a way that balances who we are.
Oh, yeah. Manny.
Hi, I'm Manny.
Hey, Manny.
Hi. There are a lot of young people in Silicon Valley that have been very successful and are still running complex, large companies that have not decided to spend as much time or money on philanthropy, changing the world, making the world better. You and Carrie have, I think, set a gold standard for investing in organizations to do research for you, actually putting a lot of money where your mouth is, getting really involved. Why do you think you've chosen to make this a priority when a lot of people haven't, frankly?
Sure. Do you want to paraphrase, or?
Did people hear him? Okay. Why do you think you've chosen to be so philanthropic when a lot of young, successful people haven't?
Sure. For one thing, I'll just say I think the culture's changing. In fact, when we were talking over there, Manny and I know each other. When we were talking over there, you mentioned traveling with Caitlin Krieger to go to a prison for partly related to criminal justice, and they're part of a new generation of young entrepreneurs that have become wealthy earlier and have decided to engage with this. So I think partially it's just like path-dependent culture stuff. I also think we're frankly just very privileged to have made the wealth very quickly. And one of the things I've observed is most people make their wealth more slowly, and sort of at each stage, you're not necessarily shocked into thinking like, what should I do with all this? It's just sort of like I've become slightly more wealthier, so I should have a slightly better standard of living, and you know, maybe eventually I'll have so much that I can think about like just giving the rest away. And for us, it was just, you know, for me especially, it was just like immediately we were extremely wealthy. It was way more than I could possibly spend in 100 lifetimes. And so I had to think a little more about like, well, okay, what do I want to do with this? How do I think about, you know, how that capital is incorporated into my life? But yeah, the short answer is I think things are changing. I think there are going to be more and more people that act more like us.
Awesome. Very last question. So we're going to come back from lunch and talk to Sam Altman and Roelof Botha about the private tech cycle, where we are, valuations too high, low, et cetera. What's your take on that? I mean, what are you seeing, both from being at Asana, but, you know, as an angel investor, the whole 9 yards?
Yeah, I see a lot of people predicting the future. And it's been really interesting. I mean, when we did our Series C, it was like right in the worst part of the sort of dip, like when Tableau and LinkedIn each took their 40% hits in a single day. And then I've just been watching it since then, and just things kind of crept back up to where they were before. So, I'm much more interested in what Sam and Roelof have to say about this type of thing, but from my perspective, there's a lot more sort of anxiety and angst about a major correction than seems to be apparent in the data. I mean, I think people have been predicting this for a very long time, and mostly we've just kind of regressed back towards the mean.
Yep.
That's my take.
Great. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Jess.